Welcome to Young People and Mental Health, a Growing Problem. The aim of this session is to explore the ideas around mental health and the issues surrounding mental health in young people. More and more young people are diagnosed with mental illnesses and want to explore what's going on, whether there is something new today which means that we're ending up with this diagnosis, or whether growing up is being diagnosed as having a mental illness if you're going through growing up as a young person. My name is Beverley Marshall and I'm going to introduce the panel. On my right-hand side is Professor Sir Simon Wessely, President of the Royal College of Psychiatrists and Head of Psychiatry and Medicine at the Institute of Psychiatry and King's College. I've got John Tomsett, who has been a teacher for 28 years and is a head teacher at a school, Huntington School. He has also written a book which is published in January, which is Mind Over Matter, This Much I Know About Mental Health. I've got sitting next to me Dr. Frankie Anderson, who's a psychiatry trainee and co-founder of the Sheffield Salon. Also Lyn Kendall, Director of Inclusion at the Westwood Academy, Gifted Child Consultant at the British Mensa, and Series Consultant Child Genius UK for Channel 4. And finally, Dave Clements, Advisor to Local Government, blogger for the Guardian and Huffington Post. So I will start with Professor Sir Simon Wessely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm a psychiatrist, as you've heard. I'm also an academic, and my profession is psychiatric epidemiology, which none of you have heard of. And that means I don't get out of bed for less than 1,000 people. And normally we live down little holes in the ground and don't see daylight for years on end. But once every 10 years, we have our brief little moment in the sun. And that moment was 2 weeks ago, because every 10 years we publish something called the Psychiatric Morbidity Survey, which is, for in our trade, a huge thing, very expensive, etc. And it's the only way we know the true prevalence of disorders, mental health disorders in the community, exactly who's getting treatment, who isn't, why, and so on. So for us, this is a huge day, and it was 2 weeks ago, and that's our little moment in the sun, then we're sent back into our holes. Now, what did we find? Well, overall, we found that not much had changed over the last 10 years, which actually isn't surprising. Most disorders in the community, in any speciality, rarely change. If they do change, it's usually because we've cheated in the way we're recording it. So the big things, schizophrenia, autism, depression, etc., have remained very stable for the last 30 or 40 years. My particular generation, 55 to 64-year-olds, are definitely letting the side down, despite the fact that we had free education, we didn't have student loans, we didn't have Hitler, we have pensions, all that kind of stuff. We're getting a bit worse, we're getting a bit more depressed, we're drinking more, and we're trying to harm ourselves more, which is really unfair, but we are. But what about the younger generation? Well, again, not much change. One thing, drinking less drugs, that's great, but the thing that caught the eyes of most people was a true change in anxiety disorders in young women, defined 16 to 24. We don't have the data for earlier than that, but I can tell you now it's going to be the same. So there has been, over 20 years, quite a substantial increase in that one area. Now, by substantial, I should still be clear that the rates have gone up from about 19% in I've forgotten the year now. When I don't remember, I just make it up. So 1991, I made that up, but it's about that time. To now, when it's at 26%, and very unfairly, there's been absolutely no change whatsoever in males, where the rates have remained from 8 to 9% over 20 years. So there is a problem, that we can be sure. We cannot be sure as to what this is, and we're going to be discussing, I'm sure, all the various views, and everybody has a view what it is, and it's very easy to blame anything that has changed in the last 20 years. It will be associated with this change, and I'm sure we'll get on to the subject of social media and so on. You know that children who use more than 3 hours of social media a day are more likely to be anxious or depressed. Cause and effect? Well, not necessarily. All of those things, this is me being the boring boffin and just saying we don't know. It could be the other way around, for example. And we can really blame it on lots of things, and I'm sure we will. We could blame it on the rise in footballers' salaries, which also has gone up at the same rate over that period. So just to be very careful before we run away with all sorts of theories and so on. So I'm just going to end then with 3, however, facts. One fact, actually very interesting. For the first time of those people, there's always been this gap between people who we, in this study, we diagnose with psychiatric disorders on the best way we do it, and then we also say, what do you think's wrong with you? And there's always been this gap of people who clearly, to us, seem to have a problem, whatever it may be, and yet don't think that they do. But this time round, nearly 100% of the population who did have a mental health problem said they did. Now, that doesn't mean that they got help for it, most don't, and so on and so forth. But at least we can say now we've reached the end of the raising awareness decade, as it were. Awareness is high. It's about what do we do about it and what do we think is wrong. And the second thing, without any shadow of doubt, is that we do not do very much or enough for those who have the severer mental health problems in childhood, well, indeed, in adulthood as well. I'm going to use a word that I don't think any doctor has said for the last 12 months, which is actually Jeremy Hunt is right. Very, very few people will say that. But he spoke 2 days ago about the crisis in providing services for young people with mental health problems, and he said this was the greatest challenge that we face. And as I say, he's absolutely right. Most families who have autism, whose children may have autism, ADHD or whatever, still either don't get any help at all or have to wait ridiculously unacceptable lengths of time for it. Those are the two facts we have. That's it. Now we're going to discuss what has happened in children's mental health. What is the narrative? Why has it happened? What should we do about it? But I'm just starting by being the boring boffin. Something has changed in the last decade, that's for sure.
Hi, I'm John Tomsett. I'm a head teacher. I've been head teacher for 14 years now. Up in York, biggest school in York, 1,500 students. And I've seen quite a lot of difficult times. I've been to, gone into the girls' toilets to find blood-spattered shirts and etc., etc. I've seen some of the worst. I also go back a long way and go back to when I was young, and I had a mum who left school when she was 13. She was a manic depressive. She never went back to school, and I grew up with a manic depressive mum. I've had to have her sectioned. I've done all that stuff. I've seen proper mental illness. And when you're 16 and you go and visit your mum and you have to have 3 padlocks to unlock the doors to the ward, that's pretty awful stuff. So I've seen mental illness in the raw. And what I find now is I agree with a lot with what Simon said, in that I can see quite clearly there is an issue, right? That's not for debate. The data tells you there's an issue. What's caused it, I think it's really complex. I did have 7, I'm writing a book at the moment, I've written a book at the moment, it's about to come out. I had 7 causes. Then I went to the university the other day in York, and I was in the Department for Health Economics, and I spoke to a guy, a professor there, and now I've got 12 causes, right? It's that complicated. So these are what I think is happening. I think there's an issue about high-stakes examinations, right? Whichever you look at it. I think it's an issue about social media, and for people of our age, I mean, I'm one of the educational Twitterati, as you call it. Ridiculous number of followers, who knows why? But I understand that stuff, and my wife has to surgically remove my phone from me most times before I go to bed. I think there's performance-related pay. I think there's high-stakes stuff for teachers. I think there are neurotic parents. I think that has a big issue. There's inequality generally in society. If you read The Spirit Level, if you read Pickett and Wilkinson, there's an issue about inequality. The cuts, I think, are the cuts to CAMS and cuts to services are really impacting on schools. And then there is this notion, I would say, that we all think we have a right to be happy, right? But actually, when you get to my age, you realise life's pretty crap most of the time, and then you just have moments of happiness, and they come along like uninvited guests, and they disappear before you know it. But that's how life is. And then there is another 5, which I think there's an openness about it. People talk about it much more, and we've come to the end of the kind of openness decade. I think there's an issue about the end of work. What are we going to do with so many people as there is less work to be had and less well-paid work to be had? I think that some of the things that are going on provide a quick route to treatment. That's a controversial one, but I think there is that. There is the next factor, which means that people don't realise that actually the route to success is darn hard work. And you just don't get that overnight, years and years of hard work and stuff. And then the bubble wrap culture. I think that we live in this kind of safe world where risk taking, which everybody would tell you is part of developing your brain, and parts of your brain that you need to develop, the element of risk taking is being taken out of things. When I was researching the book, I spoke to several people: Tony Byron, Claire Fox, is why I'm here today, Natasha Devon, Norman Lamb, and they were really, really illuminating. And the more people I spoke to, the more confused I got, actually, because it's, as Tony Byron said, it's a multifactorial thing, and it's no easy solution. I've got lots of ideas about what we might do about it, but I'll save those for later.
Great.
Thank you. So hello, my name is Frankie, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. Over the next 5 minutes, I would like to outline the case as to why we should not see our children as potential victims of the mental health crisis, and explore the wider issues related to an increasingly broadening definition of mental illness. Firstly, as a couple of pointers, I'd like to say if you want to provide good mental health care to the child who needs it, you will have to fund the services they need, and psychiatry is an underfunded specialisation. You only have to work in a psychiatric unit to see the discrepancies between physical and mental health services, and there is not a healthcare professional in the land who would not argue for increased funding and increased support for those who need it. As this is a mental health debate, I still feel the need to say that there is such a thing as mental illness, and that mental health is on a spectrum from chronic, enduring and debilitating disease to more transient emotions which recover. However, there is a fundamental question about whether our children are getting sicker, or whether our definition of what is ill has changed. The vast majority of children will not go through the childhood with severe mental health problems requiring specialist care. The redefining of normal childhood problems as mental illness, such as depression or anxiety, is a reflection of how we now cope as a society with life. One of the clearest examples of this is the redefinition of shyness. Once seen as a personality trait in a world that values gregariousness and self-expression, it is seen as a pathology, one that hampers the individual and requires external support to change it. Shyness has been variously redefined as social phobia, social anxiety disorder, through the widening of criteria instigated by DSM-5, which is how the handbook used by American psychiatrists to define mental illness, has resulted in the pathologizing of a once normal character trait, with the assumption that only through external agencies this can be changed. And for me, this results in two main issues. First, it narrows the definition of normal and pathologizes normal human variation. And two, it encourages young children and their carers to view themselves as vulnerable, as part of the diminished self and always on the verge of a mental illness. And therefore, it's understandable that children and adults are more likely to seek mental health input. If you view yourself as mentally ill, you are naturally going to seek help for it and inflate the statistics and drive the trend. But what about the cohort of children who are most likely to have severe mental health issues? According to the World Health Organization, risk factors include having a parent who has a mental health issue, problem with alcohol, being sexually or physically abused, living in poverty or being homeless. I would not recommend poverty for good mental health. And some of these problems, like being homeless or being poor, essentially social problems, will not be fixed by talking therapies of access to the medication. They require political action and require political responses. So in conclusion, I don't think mental illness in young people is necessarily a growing problem. I think we need to take a step back from a broadening definition and stop viewing the majority of children as mentally ill through exaggerated statistics. And for those that we do need help, we need to fund child and adult mental health services and put mental health on parity with physical health. But more than that, we need to take a step back from our children and ask why now, as a society, we're so keen to label children as mentally ill.
Lyn?
I've been a teacher for over 35 years now, and more recently qualified as a psychologist as well, because I just felt it was giving me a real handle on what I was doing and part of the work in school that I do. I'm not a subject teacher, I'm an inclusion coordinator, which means I work with children with SEN, gifted and talented, English as an additional language, those with behaviour problems, the whole sort of range that don't fit the treadmill that we call the education system. My specialism is working with children at the top end of the ability scale, and as part of that I work with a lot of parents who are dealing with children who are highly anxious, who worry a lot, and actually working with the children and normalising their behaviour around what they think themselves to be and what their parents think them to be and what society in general believe them to be. But I also equally work with children at the other end of the scale, and I hope to be able to speak on both ends of that. I recently assessed a young man, and we know that the waiting list for CAMS, that's the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, is around 12 to 18 months when you refer somebody in. I did a lot of work with this young person, first of all, diagnostic assessments, therapeutic work, etc. And then everything was coming up that he needed to be referred to the psychiatric care. Sent it in, and marvellously he was seen within 3 months on the basis of the report that I sent in. He was seen, and then we had a letter back from CAMS, 1 paragraph. We think he's got learning difficulties. I wrote a letter back saying, did you read my report? And that person wrote back to me and said, no, we never bother reading other reports before we see these people. At that point, I sort of banged my head off the table several times, but it's made me very much more cautious about undertaking that amount of work, even for when a child needs it, if it's not going to get anywhere. I think that 12 to 18 months to get an appointment at CAMS is actually symptomatic of a sick society rather than people themselves who are mentally ill. And I think that the pressure on the mental health service is actually a direct result of policies and practice put into place by successive governments over many years. So what's happening? Firstly, I think our young people are being kept as children for way too long. Hundreds of thousands of years people have been on this planet, and for most of those, children have become young adults at around 13, 14. And it was only 100 years ago that they were allowing 13, 14-year-olds to go and fight in World War I. They considered them adults then because it suited them to do so. Within my adult lifetime, childhood has been extended by at least 3 years. You are now forced to stay in the education system until you're 18, which is great if you're academic. But I find it a coincidence that this has happened at times of high unemployment. Physically, these are young men and women who are de-skilled by society. We are keeping them longer and longer down, not giving them any freedoms, not giving them any choices, and not giving them any responsibility. They no longer feel as if they are part of society. I think we overprotect them, and I agree there that there are too many rules and regulations. Children don't know how to take risks. They don't know how to deal with adversity when it meets them up in the face. Therefore, they become highly anxious and develop various social phobias, I guess for a different word. There is also the pressure to perform academically. As someone who advocates for children who are highly able and thinks that they have a right to a challenging education, I am also aware of the number of children that are forced through the examination system when their talents don't actually lie in that area. They may be very practical, they may be spatially aware. So I'm sort of thinking that it's actually society, and we are trying to make people fit society rather than society serving the people in it.
The Local Government Association claim that substantial numbers of children and young people are suffering from anxiety, depression, self-harm, having problems with their body image, with exam stress. A number of other organisations make similar claims. So the Association for School and College Leaders say that children today face an extraordinary range of pressures. They face enormously high expectations, they say. New technologies present totally new challenges, such as cyberbullying. But perhaps the claim that you hear most of all, and it tends to be repeated over and over again, is the statistic that 1 in 10 children and young people suffer from a clinically diagnosable mental health problem. I looked into this piece of research because it sounded a little bit unlikely. It comes from the Office for National Statistics in 2004, so it's already a little bit old. And it's based on diagnoses that were made by clinicians who didn't see those children. They were interviewed by researchers from the ONS, and then the clinicians went through those transcripts and used those to make their diagnoses. More than half of those 1 in 10 were described as having conduct disorders, which I think in the past, I'm sure Simon could say more about this, would have been understood as being naughty children rather than having a mental disorder. And more than a third had emotional disorders. This included things like anxiety and depression, but also things like phobias, like a fear of dogs was included as an example. So that's the kind of thing they're talking about when they say that 1 in 10 children and young people have a mental health problem. I think the expansion of the definition of what it means to be mentally ill is a worrying development. And I think that was kind of related to what Simon was saying about there's not a shyness amongst people to describe themselves as having a mental health problem anymore. There's no taboo, despite what campaigners say. You know, I think it's kind of everyone's out there wanting to claim to have a mental health illness. I'm almost surprised more of us don't say it. The impression is given that a big and growing problem exists and that these very different concerns are somehow related or on a continuum. We no longer seem to be able to discern between the emotional ups and downs that are part and parcel of growing up from serious mental health problems that require some sort of expert or outside help. I think there's a real problem here, but it's not that children are more unwell or that the world is any more challenging than it used to be. I think we've adopted a narrative of vulnerability, and it affects the way young people understand themselves and the way they understand what they're capable of. Simon also mentioned awareness raising, suggesting that we've reached the end of the raising awareness period. I kind of wish we had. It seems to be an endless campaign on a number of levels from various organisations, both in relation to children and adults. I think young people are actually picking up on the message from these campaigns that they're defined by their vulnerabilities, and they're unable to cope with what in the past would have been regarded as quite unremarkable facts of life. I think this is debilitating for them, and it's catastrophic for mental health services. The Association for School and College Leaders conducted a survey, and they found that more than half of schools report increased stress and anxiety among their pupils. 4 out of 5 of those schools said that their pupils are experiencing more self-harm and suicidal thoughts. Lyn mentioned CAMS, the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, who treat young people, or who should treat young people who have mental health problems. The Children's Commissioner conducted a report in England and found that 28% of children referred to CAMS do not receive any service at all. An estimated quarter of referrals include conditions such as self-harm, psychosis, severe depression, anorexia, and suicidal tendencies, conditions that are potentially life-threatening. Only 14% of these are estimated to access any service, and half of them just go on a waiting list. And those waiting lists can last for months, possibly even years. There's a variation across the country. So, how do we solve the crisis? I think in the education world, teachers are becoming glorified therapists, not educators. I think they're trying to treat young people rather than teach them. I don't blame them for that. That's the agenda at the moment. I also think that if they want children and young people to flourish and become well-adjusted young adults, teachers should be teaching children, not treating them as ill. But it's not just about teaching, it's not just about education, it's also about all of us. I think we all, as adults, need to be holding the line. I think we need to be telling children that being stressed, feeling down, it's just part of growing up in the majority of cases. A child being naughty isn't grounds for expert intervention. And so basically I think we just need to take back responsibility for raising our children and preparing them for adulthood rather than outsourcing it.
Okay, I'm going to throw it out to the floor for any comments, questions.
I'm from the United States, where I think this may be a slightly more developed trend, but even there, cases of mental health issues are increasing. I have a friend who is in special education at a university, and she was saying that she started, I don't know, 5 years ago, and every year the numbers of students needing accommodations has gone up and up and up. So now she has 3 staff, and they all have 365 children each who they have to make accommodations for. I live in a school district where we have no librarian, but we have 4 therapists on staff. And when you ask the teachers, what do we need? They say, oh, you can't get rid of the therapists, because everybody agrees that this is an important thing. And I don't want to get into causes, but I'm just wondering, why now? What is the mechanism, do you think, that is driving people to see things this way, to see themselves this way, and to see students this way?
The NUS produced a figure that 8 out of 10 university students had suffered from a mental health problem. And you sort of think, how do they reach a conclusion even closer to that? It's just bizarre. But what I wanted to ask is about trying to get at the possibility of any genuine problems. So there's been an explosion of awareness around not just men's, specifically mental health, but also men's suicide. So young men killing themselves, and the often cited figure is suicide is the biggest killer of young men in the last 10 years. It kills more young men than anything else. Now, I've heard someone say about that statistic is that the reason is that young men don't tend to die of anything else when they're young. So, but is there anything to the explosion of awareness around men's mental health specifically?
I was just interested in what you were saying about living in a bubble-wrap society. I'm a school teacher and I teach reception in year 1. I see very robust children coming into my school. But, in terms of causes, we all think we know what the cause is. There is a rise in anxiety in young girls. And for me, I would say sometimes it's the lack of authority of adults that before I came in here, I would have said that lack of authority of adults leave children in quite anxious positions. So we ask them to do things that maybe they shouldn't have to do when they're young. So, school councils and giving children the right to decide what happens in their school. For me as a school teacher, I'd rather decide what happens in the school and, let the children get on with going out to play. So there is a kind of sense of you've got to be responsible when you're not actually ready as a child for things that happen, for adult decisions, whilst at the same time being put in a bubble wrap society where you're not allowed to climb on a tree in case you fall down and hurt yourself. So it just got me thinking that if that's the case, if we're giving them too much to do and to worry about too young, but we're also protecting them too much, is there something to do with the fact that we are actually focusing too much on children and making them an issue and therefore having to give them something that they need to label themselves with?
Hi, I was kind of interested in the issue of why today, because if you think about kids today, there's no real reason why they shouldn't be able to face, problems of existence any more than kids 20, 30 years ago. I mean, social media is often mentioned as quite traumatic for children. I use that word dangerously. But, kids have went through wars and I've had to face much bigger issues, but we didn't have this explosion of mental health issues that we seem to have with young people. And it made me think, well, it must be something to do with the language or the kind of environment that young people are growing up in these days. And as a parent of 2 teenagers, the amount of stuff you get from school around creating a therapeutic environment for the children is at least as much as you get around creating a learning environment. The number of pieces of material I've had on bullying at school, is your child bullying? We have to be very sensitive to these things. I work in a university with a very large student services department. The counselling service is completely overwhelmed. But when you look at the stuff they've got on the website, it's almost inviting students to come along as vulnerable. It's almost saying to them, look, kids, learning is a dangerous business. It can be traumatic. So it's something to do with, I think it's something to do with the kind of environment that we've been bringing kids up into. And I think that's got to do with our responsibility as adults. What are we actually doing? What are we actually saying to these people? Are you not tough enough to be able to face these things?
Thank you.
Well, I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist based in Oxford. I trained in Greece, but I was appointed as a consultant 10 years ago in the UK. Some observations I've made through the years. Number one, when we were being trained, young people and indeed parents would come with a complaint. They would say, I'm struggling with this, can you help? Through the years, I've realized that they come with a diagnosis. Either a parent or a young person will come and say, I think I've got autism, I think I've got bipolar because Stephen Fry has it, or whoever, or I'm struggling with my son. Could it be that he's been autistic 15 years now and nobody has actually found out? And that's the parent. That's observation number one. The conclusions are yours. Observation number two. Developmental disorders, based on the diagnostic systems that we use, are ones that manifest early in life, in several areas in a person's functioning. So ideally ones that the latest would have been diagnosed by the age of 6, 7, at the extreme 8 or 9 or 10. And what I mean by that, I don't want to make it too medical, autism, ADHD. I now see, after 10 years, developmental diagnosis being made at the age of 20, 25. I see ADHD services being set up for adults and indeed ending up with waiting lists. And nobody's looking at what else could be causing this person's problems. For example, depression can cause a person not to concentrate. Extreme anxiety can cause a person not to concentrate. Lack of concentration doesn't always equal ADHD. But nobody goes down the route of looking at that. The other thing is, things have progressed further in the last few months, I realize, with horror. They don't come now with a diagnosis, they come with a treatment request. I want citalopram. For what? No diagnosis, no depression, so I struggle, therefore I want citalopram because my father has been having it for years and it's helped him. Yeah, but with what? If you're struggling with exams, you don't necessarily need citalopram to succeed in your exams. So I am actually horrified, and although I heard with actually relief that percentages and prevalence in the UK hasn't changed through the years, I don't know to what extent this is compatible with what the colleague, the trainee, has observed, that indeed inhibition, what we call temperamental inhibition, what you call shyness, is actually increasing, it's becoming medicalized. Could that fit in with the increase in anxiety disorders and social anxiety disorders in young females? People are now coming and they want a label as though this will free them out from all responsibility and agency about what's going on in their lives. So this is a way, but a very distorted way of beating stigma, but actually stigma is still out there, I have to say, and the ones that have the most debilitating problems are the ones that are struggling most. The ones that are having transient problems are the ones that want the labels most, I'm saddened to say, and I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'm going to take a few more questions, then I'm going to come back to the panel.
I'd be interested in hearing the panel's idea on how to balance that kind of sense of life is tough and it might be stressful, and no one has the right to be happy all the time, and that's something we have to teach children. But that there's also space for them to be vulnerable and to seek help when they need it, because it slightly feels like it might be one or the other, and something around maybe the change of language and talking more about what I would call resilience, like ability to get through the difficult times, but not necessarily on your own.
Gentleman behind her.
Hi there, I'm a politics student, so I come at this with a slightly different angle. I focus on security studies, and not to get into too much detail, one of the theories that we use is called securitization theory, whereby issues become security issues whenever you talk about them in a certain way. So if you heighten them into being a risk factor, then people start to see them as security, and so on and so forth. This is relevant to this, I think, because over the past couple of years, especially as the research you've been talking about, as we have heightened awareness of mental illness, and as people talk about it more and more as something which can affect anybody, which can affect everybody, and is this thing which we should all be afraid of and we should all pay a great amount of attention to, I'm wondering if that has had an impact on people coming forward, thinking, or self-diagnosing. It was mentioned by an early contributor. And just one other thing, I'm gay, I work with a lot of LGBT organisations, and there's this massive focus now on LGBT mental health, which is a big thing. But we have a lot of people who now say, I'm coming out and I am depressed as a result of that. Or whenever I'm being asked questions about my coming out experience, the first question I get asked is, what mental health issues did you face whenever you came out? there's that assumption there that you will have gone through some kind of traumatic experience, and I wonder if that has a contribution as well.
Hi. To go back to what the lady at the front was saying from Oxford, I think, yeah, talking about self-diagnosis, I run a mental health awareness group at my university, University of Kent, and we do get a lot of people sort of messaging the Facebook page, emailing us saying, I think I have this, where can I go? Because we refer them to support on campus. And I honestly think that the rise in self-diagnosal, basically, is to do with the lack of services. If a doctor isn't going to pay attention to you, and a lot of the time they don't, if you go to your GP and they dismiss you, they say, you know, a friend of mine honestly had a doctor say to her, what could you possibly be stressed about? You're 19. If you get that kind of dismissal, you're going to say, well, I know there is something not right with me. Am I just going to have to tell them so that they give me help? I don't think it's an issue of people having too much awareness of mental health. I think that's a very reductionist point of view. I think it's to do with giving people the services they need.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to Simon. One of the things you said was that over 20 years there's been increases. Something has changed. What do you think that is?
Well, it's very clear people have raised virtually every ill in society, and we don't quite know. Absolutely truthfully, we don't quite know. I mean, just playing the boring boffin part just for a little bit longer, certain things we do know. For example, you were quite right. Actually, suicide rates in children and young people has not changed now for 30 years. But the statistic, for example, now suicide is the largest cause of death for pregnant women is actually true, but that's because of a huge change in obstetric safety. So the rate hasn't actually changed. Then, looking about why has this been this change, I think it's a combination of two things which are working in mutually exclusive ways. And I just want to pick up what you were saying about the US, where we can see that rather more clearly, and perhaps we can see what we might be like in 15 years' time. Now, if you take a thing like ADHD, attention deficit disorder, which when I was training, allegedly didn't exist, but it's very clear, does exist. It is a disorder. It's not that common. Its prevalence is around 2% of children, and there are quite good treatments for it, actually. But it's not the most common problem, but it's there, and that's very well established, and it isn't getting any commoner. It's remaining the same. Now, in the States, which has the same prevalence, nevertheless, 12% of all children are on treatment for ADHD, which is 6 times the possible prevalence of the disorder. And even worse, of those who do have the disorder, most are not getting treatment. So most of those, and it goes with social disadvantage, ethnic minority, poor schooling. So even those who do have it don't get it, but meanwhile, millions of children are getting treatment for something they don't have. Now, we haven't got to that point in this country. We do have overdiagnosis, but we also have underdiagnosis, and the study that I'm just telling you about, I'm boring, I promise you I'm a really boring boffin, confirms that most children who still do have ADHD in this country are not getting treatment. So we haven't come close to the tipping point where America has gone over. And I suppose the example I would use to that is you turn, I'm the president of the Royal College, and when you do your first day, you have to do all these press interviews, and the thing is, you've got to be boring. You've got to be really dull. Don't say anything interesting. So you always say, oh, I'm in listening mode, I'm here to, you know, all the shit that you're talking about and that kind of thing. So please don't say anything interesting. So I got through it all without saying anything interesting at all until 1 minute to go. It was the Times, and they said, has anything annoyed you recently? He was obviously falling asleep. And I suddenly did a diatribe of being at a middle-class dinner party the night before in North London, where I was fed up with the fact that every single parent around the room had a child with autism who also was doing PPE at Oxford. And I said, that's just not possible. And, oh, God, the number of letters I got from saying, I'm doing PPE at Oxford and I have autism. I said, no, you don't. You definitely don't. You know, you're just not very good with girls or whatever it is. But I also got a huge number of letters from parents whose children did have autism. Autism is a awful problem. Most of whom they would have been delighted if they were talking, let alone going to school, etc. And they talked about the lack of services, how difficult it was to get support, how difficult it was to have anything done, and they were very, very fed up with the overdiagnosis of eccentricity and normal variations in personality in the community, which was clearly diverting attention from this really serious child mental health problem. And my God, it's serious. So that's the point. We are in danger of doing both. We're overdiagnosing, but we're also underdiagnosing.
Okay, John, you can come in on anything else, but you mentioned a number of factors, issues at the coalface as a teacher, head teacher. Neurotic parents. What do you, I mean,
good luck with
can
this
you
one.
explain that?
I tell a lovely tale. Year 11 parents' evening last year, and the senior team had about 10 students each. About 5 of us had 10 students each, and we wanted an extraordinary meeting with their parents and the child. And we kind of tell them how it really is with 6 months to go. And lad comes in, he's just a lad, kind of immobile lad, nice lad, very calm. Mum was on the ceiling. Just blew up. I said, well, the thing is, this is a... And at one point, the lad said, "It's okay, sir, I'll look after her." I felt really sorry for the lad, because the mum was through the roof. And we've got into this position where academic success and going to the right university is so exalted in the outcomes of your education that actually we're losing sight of what the rounded education is. Now, you see, at our school, I think head teachers set the weather. They make the weather, right? You can determine the culture of your school. And back in February, there was lots of stuff going around about me online and in the Guardian and in other educational publications, because I spoke to my staff and I said, I don't want you to do any extra lessons at all in the run-up to the examinations. I just want you to concentrate on being a great teacher. Right? Anybody who thinks that 10 after-school lessons every Wednesday for the last 10 weeks before the examination is going to make up for 18 months of not working very hard in the lessons is pretty foolish. Right? So I think you just got to teach really well. Right? And I mean really well. We're a research school, so we do lots on metacognition, lots on training students how to improve, how to learn. Right? Because I think learning's really hard. It's taken me 40 years. I'm 52. It's taken me 50 odd years to learn how to learn. Right? But I know how to learn. And what I concentrate most on is the mental processes for learning in students, to show them how to learn. And once they've got those tools, they're far calmer about everything. Right? They're far calmer because they're better learners. I think the thing we have to do is teach much better than we do in the state system. And that's not going to happen so long as governments keep pillaring teachers and driving people out of the profession. What you have to do is get the brightest and the shiniest in education, in state schools, and teach brilliantly.
Frankie, you don't think it's a growing problem?
Can I ask a couple of more
questions
to the floor? I think this increasing use of medical parlance and everyday language is really interesting, actually. No one has come up to me and said, oh, I think I might be a bit schizophrenic today. You know, it's a very particular time, I think I might be a bit anxious, might be a bit bipolar. And I think that is a reflection of perhaps a more kind of a glamorization, to a certain extent, of some mental illnesses through kind of TV documentaries such as like Stephen Fry, a kind of acceptance of other, the more kind of neuroses type mental illnesses, as opposed to kind of people we view as scary patients with schizophrenia. And I think the stigma for mental illness is still there for certain illnesses. The second thing I wanted to talk about was why now? And I wonder whether or not it's got to do with the kind of rise in the kind of identity politics as being the dominant theme in today's political narrative. So diagnosing yourself with another mental illness or diagnosing yourself with something else becomes the kind of fabric of who you are as a person. So as opposed to having an external focus, as opposed to having a kind of political system or a religious system or an external focus to your life and your identity, those systems no longer exist. So we now look inwardly. We look at an inward narrative, which says, well, it's on the focus of the self. And I think, it's kind of one more sort of facet of our personality that we go back and we talk to people about. What I mean about it not being a growing problem is I think how we interpret day-to-day life is now put through a medical spectrum. I think we view things which are... Growing up is tough, okay? Being an adult is tough. And I don't think that these feelings and emotions aren't real. I just don't necessarily think they are a psychiatric illness which requires psychiatric treatment to them. And my point about the kind of social and economic drivers is that actually if you live in an unpleasant environment, if you have access to cannabis and you are off work, we know that being unemployed is a major factor for depression. That's not necessarily the fact that if you are socially isolated, you are more likely to be depressed. Would you rather your depression was treated by being offered a job and not being socially isolated than by giving a tablet? And I think what I'm trying to say is we cannot just look at these problems as being a medical answer, because they are being driven by social and economic drivers as well.
Can I just come in there? I interviewed Ken McLaughlin for my book, and we were talking about what happened after Thatcher destroyed the unions. And we became that the people who work for unions don't actually represent groups of people anymore. They just do individual cases, right?
Yeah.
And because society has become individualised, and the more individual and the more inward-looking we are, the less we feel part of a community, less we're sharing things. So there is an individualisation that I think has made people just internalise themselves. And there's a great line that comes from Catherine Eccleston and Dennis Hayes' book, which begins something like, you know you're in trouble when students go to school to learn more about themselves than about the world. Right? And I think there is something in that too that we've got to get away from.
Thank you. Lyn, you can come back on anything else, but you raised quite a lot of interesting points in your introduction. You mentioned there's a pressure on children to perform. Do you think that is a major factor in developing mental health issues?
I think, in fact, yes, there's a pressure on children to perform. The pressure also, and I very much agree with this lady up here, is there's also a huge amount of pressure on parents, a huge amount of pressure on teachers. Parents are continually under the microscope by school, by media and everything else to make sure that they're doing everything right. Are they wearing the right trainers? Are they going to the right school, as you've said? But equally, there are an increasing number of rules which are restricting parenting. I won't raise... Well, the smacking one is always a sort of one that people like to argue about. But the truth is, putting something in place like that, saying parents can no longer smack their children, hasn't stopped the number of children getting beaten to death by their parents or getting injured by their parents. What it has done is restricted ordinary people and stopped them and made them very anxious themselves about their parenting. Coming back to the gentleman about men's mental health and suicide, we are in a situation at school where if a child says, oh, I feel like killing myself, we immediately have to go and report that to the safeguarding officer. Even if it's done in what appears to be jest, the fact that the child has said that, we then have to go and report it to the safeguarding officer, fill in a form, and they have to start referring through to mental health services or social services and see what's going on there in case it's true. So we are under pressure all the time. We're putting children under that microscope, but we are under pressure to watch every single individual child as well. The children themselves are being put under pressure. I've said it's all very well for the bright ones. They put themselves under pressure anyway. But the children at the other end of the ability scale who have already had, by the time they come to me in year 7, have already had 6 years of failure, 6 years of being at the bottom of the pile, and now looking forward to another 5 years of it and being put through academic subjects which aren't their thing. They haven't got the capability to deal with them. Yet if you gave them something to build or something to make or something to design, they would actually excel at. And I think the education system has become too narrow, certainly, but I think we need to be looking at groups of children, groups of individuals, and seeing what their strengths are. Then we're not going to get people feeling marginalised and frustrated.
Thank you. Dave, do come back on anything else, but you also mentioned the fact that we've got a kind of... We see children as vulnerable in a way, a greater extent than we did.
John was talking, and I agreed about a number of things, but I agreed with what you were saying just a moment ago, but earlier on you were you seem to be suggesting that academic success and the pursuit of academic success is a bad thing.
No, never would say that ever.
Right. It's a good thing.
Misinterpreted.
I must have.
It's the most important thing.
Okay. I'm glad to hear it.
If you Daniel Moyes, who's research.
We've only got a little limited time. Let Dave finish.
I have lots of ammunition to say to counteract.
Well, let me just caricature you for the moment, so you can come back on in a second. But I did certainly get the impression that you were suggesting that there's something problematic about the pursuit of academic success.
Please.
Let me finish it. Let me finish what I'm saying. You can contest it afterwards.
It's so not true.
And I think there's also a suggestion which you haven't brought up, but it fits in with this broader sense in which education itself seems to be presented as a mental health problem. The pursuit of excellence, being forced to sit exams, which there are fewer of today than there ever used to be. There's more testing at a younger age, but again, that tends to be opposed on the grounds that children are too vulnerable, can't cope with it. And I just think that's a problem. I don't think we should be portraying education in that way. And so I'll leave that there, and John can come back on that.
I will.
But I'm sure you will. There's somebody in the audience in the higher education field, the student running the mental health group, suggested that more students self-diagnosing is a consequence of a lack of services. I think you've got that the wrong way around. I think what's happening is that, as part of these awareness campaigns that seem to be everywhere, young people, are picking up on this idea that they have a mental health issue, and then they try and pursue it, and they try and get services. That overwhelms services. As a consequence, we have the kind of situation we've got with CAMHS. They can't cope, and then there will be underdiagnosis because they're unable to focus on those areas where there's a real major problem.
I don't know if you understand how undermining that is to somebody with a genuine mental health condition.
Okay. Okay, but I disagree with you. On resilience, somebody mentioned resilience. It's interesting the way the term resilience has changed in recent times, over the past 10 years or so. Resilience used to mean a person drawing on their own resources and facing up to a particular situation. It doesn't mean that anymore. In fact, the person who asked that question said that resilience isn't necessarily about drawing on your own resources. It's about going to other agencies. I think this is part of the problem. Again, young people are being encouraged to look outside themselves and being encouraged to get in professional help when it may not be necessary. And so finally, what I want to kind of lead up to is that somebody suggested that adult authority may be a problem here. I think in a number of ways, adult authority is implicated in this problem. Like, in a very kind of almost flippant sense, that we've talked about neurotic parents. There's also, within the teaching profession, there's a lot of discussion about stress, about sick leave, and if you read the Teacher Network on the Guardian, a lot of the articles are all about that. The social workers, they all talk about it as well, about being too stressed to deal with the kids that they have to work with. Parents, there's a discussion around parents being anxious about the kids at home during the school holidays, and where can they take them and how can they keep them occupied. And then there's another panic about what do they do on the first day of how do they get them to the school, and what about buying the school uniform? Everything is turned into a mental health issue. Everything is turned into anxiety and stress. So it's in that sense that we're projecting a lot of these problems onto young people. And I think that can lead to a situation where there's lack of perspective. We don't know what's normal and what's abnormal anymore. There's no abnormal psychology in this sense. Stress, bullying, depression, they're all discussed in terms of a widespread problem that all young people, or a large minority of them at least, have. And I'll just briefly go back to that 1 in 10 statistic. As I said, half of those 1 in 10 young people who are supposed to have a mental health problem have been diagnosed with a conduct disorder. It's interesting that would suggest that adult authority is the issue there as well. It's about conduct, it's about behaviour, it's about adults not feeling confident about how they manage people's behaviour.
Okay, I'm going to go back out to the audience to get as many questions as possible, comments.
I'm 15, I'm in high school, so I think I have quite a biased yet appropriate opinion on this. I think it's interesting that education has been talked about most so far. That shows that it's incredibly relevant. I think overall, this overbearingness that society has in terms of mental health is a societal apology for fucking us over so much. I think it's a correlation between not only social media, which is what a lot of adults like to blame it on, but also the fact that there is so much pressure and stress put on us at a time in our lives when we are not yet developed to handle it, and we are, becoming aware of what a fuck up the world is in general, and also having to deal with the stress. So when you put those things together, it clashes, and it really does create disaster inside minds that are becoming explorative and looking at the world differently.
Gentleman in front of you.
It sort of seems to be going round in circles, like which, did CAMS get overwhelmed first, and then when really, if I think there's a difference between a mental health problem and positive emotional health. And, if someone does have shyness, I'm not saying that needs psychiatric help, but if they're asking for help with that, back to what you said about resilience being a personal thing, I don't think there's anything wrong with someone needing to learn how to deal with something so they then can.
I'm a student, and I think, respectfully, I think it's naive to say what you said, because I feel slightly, I don't know how everyone else feels, but I feel like it's slightly been trivialised, and I think it's so important for young people, and respectfully, life now is different to how it was, even 1 year ago. Life for me is different for how it was for my parents, and I think that change requires action, and I think that the way that mental health is treated should be different depending on the time that we're living in, and also where you are. I think also a big problem is glamorising mental health problems makes it so much more difficult for people with legitimate problems to get help. And I'm not saying that people can't have legitimate concerns about themselves, but what I am saying is that misportraying, mental health problems like anorexia, bulimia, and making it, romanticising it and making it sound, this amazing thing, oh, aren't you so skinny? I think it's really affecting people with serious problems. And I think that to say that self-diagnosing is not as a result of poor help from, the GP, I think that's naive. And I think that the NHS and any mental health service has a responsibility to us as young people to take our legitimate concerns seriously instead of throwing us off with a leaflet and just pretending like they don't exist.
Thank you. Gentleman in the grey.
I'd just like to look at it as a political issue, because I think what we're seeing is the discourse of mental health is how political and moral claims are increasingly made today. So with the collapse of the old sort of political parties, the vacuum's been filled by a lot of what term advocacy organisations, the ones that try to raise our awareness of various things. But part of the problem you get, to get their particular campaign from the pre-political that nobody's interested in to the political with a capital P, they often have to exaggerate the extent of the problem to generate really good headlines. So every 10 years or so, you get Simon and his team bringing out the psychiatric morbidity report. But virtually every fortnight, you get an advocacy research group telling you that there's 70 to 80% of people suffering mental health problems. And the reason they're doing that is to generate headlines, and they also use a very woolly definition of sort of what constitutes a mental health problem. I've seen sexual promiscuity, alcohol, drug misuse. I've seen them in many of these advocacy research reports. So I think in that sense, as a political issue, I just wanted to make another couple of points. The stigma
We've got really limited time.
The stigma one's interesting because, people will say, I'm feeling a bit schizo today. I worked with a lot of people with serious mental illnesses. Not once did one of them ever tell anyone they didn't know, I'm a paranoid schizophrenic.
Thank you. Guy in the pink top.
Hi, I'm 17, and I'd just like to say that I agree with everything that the young people have said, and it's nice that we're finally able to actually have a voice for the things that's us and not these adults keep telling us how we should be feeling. And that's what I think really lies at the centre of this issue, is that this whole debate you've been throwing around, life is tough, it's meant to be stressful, these have much bigger effects than I think anyone realises, and the flippant remarks really lie at the centre of all of this. Like, for example, you were saying that there's no change in boys' mental health because boys are constantly told that we're straightforward, we don't have the same problems with girls and friendships and things like that. And I think that maybe there is a generational issue here, and because we're constantly told how we should be feeling, you know, there's issues with things like self-harm in the media. If you're not self-harming, then maybe you're not depressed. And like, I know people who have felt like they've had to act in a certain way to prove that they're unhappy with the way they're feeling, and that's so wrong. And I just think you said that resilience doesn't mean the same thing anymore, and it doesn't, and so many things don't mean the same thing. So I think we have to think more about what we're saying before we say it, every little remark that's thrown around, because all of them just have a much bigger repercussion than
Okay,
is given.
so we're going to that lady there.
I am also a student, and I respectfully disagree with some of the other students. What I have seen, at least from where I moved to where I went to college, is this almost this weird desire to be conventional, or to not to go against rules, or to say, oh fuck this is stupid, or like I've rarely ever seen people, like everyone who goes around university and it's like, oh, I'm so stressed about my homework, never ever goes to the professor, says it's a 0, I couldn't do it, I don't have time, right? So like the willingness to basically take risks and kind of carry the bad consequences for maybe some decisions that you make that were good decisions objectively, but that may have consequences. Like, I think people have just become, at least in my generation, less willing to kind of deal with that. And I think that may be due to parents. It may be due to the fact that we are so stressed. We have no time. There are increasing demands on stuffing your resumes. There's no time to think. There's very little time to kind of talk to your friends, be like, hey, maybe I'm really shy. Have you ever felt this shy? Like, what did you do about that, right? So it seems more legitimate almost to go to a psychologist, because that's a commitment that, is okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
A student up there said people should be able to get treatment, and I think the problem, as she said, is like, if somebody has shyness, and that's the problem right there. What do you mean they have shyness? They are shy, and that's the issue. And the other issue is, a lot of people are like, oh, my day, I was talking like an older person. They're like, oh, you had war and this, and if I go to war, how do I solve the issue? I kill the other person, and hopefully I make it home. That's the solution, right? If I'm like a peasant and I can't feed my family, what do I do? I steal food, or I find a job because there's a lot of labor. If you're a student today, it's a different world. It's like a void. The route to what you need to get done is not there. Like, just feeding yourself or getting water is a very simple thing. I get water, I'm thirsty, I have water, and now I'm alive. I've accomplished what I need to do. And now there's just so many different avenues to accomplish things that it's not your basic needs that need to be met. It's a higher level, and that's the issue. And one more thing. The internet, I think also people are self-diagnosing themselves because there's internet. When I was younger, I didn't have internet. I couldn't diagnose myself because I wasn't educated enough.
Thank you.
I just think there's a real tension in this discussion, which I find very difficult to work out which way it goes, which is that when talking about the social and cultural and economic problems, or fucked upness, to use the girl's phrase down there, of current society, it does seem like that there's generally agreement between those who say there's been a rise in mental health problems amongst young people, and those who say there's been a rise in the diagnosis of mental health problems amongst young people, that we're medicalising kind of, so in inverted commas, normal features of life. And to me, it's a question about causality, really, because it seems to me equally plausible that society, the various trends that people have described in society are making us define more things as problems of mental ill health, for the reasons that I think have been very persuasively argued on the panel. But I also wonder, is it also the case that people internalising these definitions then develop mental ill health as a consequence? That whole kind of thing about society makes you mad. And that's the tension that I find very difficult to resolve. But one thing I would say is, I don't think this is a discussion about a real mental health problem and a fake mental health problem. I think there's young people who feel that they're experiencing mental health problems genuinely do feel they're experiencing them. The discussion that we're trying to have here is about the extent to which this is kind of framed and then how it's dealt with and treated at a policy and also a professional level.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go back to the panel. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to start with Simon. You've got just less than 1 minute.
Okay. First of all, three things. I mean, I did start out by saying the facts are there has been a rise in mental health problems correctly diagnosed by the proper, however we do it, in the last 10 years. So that's clear. So there's dispute about what's happened, what it's due to, but not about what has happened. Second, it was quite nice. I imagine that everyone would blame social media because that's normally what happens when we have these discussions, and hardly anyone has. And I was about to say, actually, I think that's been a pretty good thing. I wish I'd had it when I was a kid. And far from decreasing people's desire to communicate, meet and interact, which is so vital to development, it seems to have made it a lot easier. It's a lot easier for my son sitting over there to have had a good time at university than it was for me. So I don't regard that as a bad thing, and it's also helped some people have difficulty in communication to actually do so. But what about the third thing? Well, I do think we have to agree, well, maybe disagree, but certainly there has been a change in the capacity to accept risk in parents, which is then reflecting on. And so, you know, there was I don't know where these statistics come from, but I love the one about the roaming distance that children has, the distance that they will go away from home on their own has gone down by 90% over 20 years. I don't quite know how someone could know that, but it does seem correct to me. And the capacity to be allowed to take risk, etc., has changed dramatically in the way parents. Stranger fear, well, it still has been the case for 100 years. You have a 1 in a million chance of being murdered by a stranger. That's not changed for a century. And yet we would now think it's the commonest risk we have, apart from being told by the chairman to shut up, which is a very big risk.
Thank you.
I probably have the worst designation on this panel, really, as a head teacher. But I think we're at a point where we accept there is an issue, and certainly we accept there is an issue in our school. And I think what I've got to do is make sure that I equip every single adult who works in my school with the ability to have a structured conversation with a student. Right? If a student comes into form group with a black eye, we are professionally duty bound to pursue that black eye and find out why it's happened. If someone comes in puts their head on the desk and looks a bit dishevelled, we could ignore that, right? But I think we need to be slightly more curious, because I think there is an issue. And most of the time, that conversation that we can have that's structured will be fine. Right? But imagine if you're 24 and you've just started teaching and you think, I could get into this conversation, but I may get to the point where someone says, I'm cutting myself, I'm ideating suicide, I never come out of my bedroom. What do I do then? I don't know what to do. So you need to train people to know what to do at that point and know there's an exit point to people who are in the institution who can take that on. And I think that's the support we need to put in for our young people. I really passionately believe that's true. And then teach brilliantly.
Great, thank you. Frankie?
So I'm actually 31, which is not that old. Thank you very much. So I have 2 points I want to make. The first is about framing yourself as vulnerable, and actually I have a real issue with this. Okay, so when Simone de Beauvoir wrote Feminine Mystique, she didn't say hide behind your white picket fence and don't go out because the world is frightened. Okay, C.L.R. James didn't go let's exert our authority to a sort of temporary body over there that we're not sure if they have our best interests at heart. As an individual, you can go out and you can change the world, okay? You will need to recognise, however, that the world may not want to change for you. And how you do that is by having faith in yourself and believing in yourself. It is not by going to a counselling service. It is not by viewing yourself through the prism of mental illness. It's by going out and engaging with the world and seeing that it's tough, but it's worth doing. And that's really why I have an issue with young people today viewing themselves as vulnerable, okay? Because it stops you going out into life and achieving what you need to achieve.
Thank you. Lyn, you've got less than 30 seconds on the clock.
I have 3 rules when dealing with parents. 3 pieces of advice I give them. Teach your children how to lose. Teach your children how to study. And teach your children how to socialise. Because so many of us, teachers and parents alike, don't have time to do that these days. I stick with that.
Thank you. 30 seconds, sir.
I think a number of young people over-identify with mental health and their what they believe to be their mental health problems. And I think the angry response of a couple of people in the audience to some of the things I've said suggests that that's the case. There is this over-identification with this sense of themselves as embattled and like nobody ever in previous times, as if this is the worst time to live, and it's just not plausible. So having said that, I've also been accused of trivialising the issue, and I'm really not. So what I'm trying to argue is that mental health campaigners themselves are trivialising the issue. They're turning it into an everyday problem that everybody has. And by doing that, they're creating a situation where those people who do have a mental health issue are struggling to receive the help they need.
Thank you. Thanks very much.